Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on the programme, the US President Donald Trump says he is committed to buying and owning Gaza, but he said that some areas of the territory could be rebuilt by other countries in the Middle East. Russia says that in order for a deal to be struck on ending the war in Ukraine, all of President Putin's conditions must be met. Well, President Trump says he's spoken to his Russian opposite number, but Moscow is remaining tight-lipped about it. And President Trump says he plans to introduce 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports, fueling concerns of an all-out multi-front trade war. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump has reiterated his commitment to buying and owning the Palestinian territory of Gaza. However, he stated that he would allow sections of the land to be rebuilt by other Middle Eastern states. Well, on Sunday, he told reporters aboard Air Force One that in his opinion, Gaza is a really big real estate site. Well, President Trump also said that he's open to the possibility of allowing some Palestinian refugees into the United States, but that he would consider such requests on a case-by-case basis.
I'm committed to buying and owning Gaza. As far as us rebuilding it, we may give it to other states in the Middle East to build sections of it. Other people may do it through our auspices. But we're committed to owning it, taking it, and making sure that Hamas doesn't move back. There's nothing to move back into. The place is a demolition site. It'll be, the remainder will be demolished. Everything's demolished.
President Trump speaking there. Well, while he made those remarks, Arab nations have been quick to condemn this and previous statements made by the US president. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, meanwhile, had suggested that a Palestinian state could be established on Saudi territory. Well, Saudi Arabia has responded by affirming its categorical rejection to Netanyahu's proposal to displace Palestinians from their land. Well, Egypt and Jordan have also condemned Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks, with Cairo deeming the suggestion a direct infringement on Saudi sovereignty. Well, we can speak now to Aaron David Miller, former advisor and peace negotiator, who joins us from DC. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Just for the benefit of our audience, you were an advisor to both Republican and Democratic secretaries of state, and most recently you were a senior advisor for Arab-Israeli relations. Just picking up on what the US president has been saying the last few days, he's beginning to sound pretty serious about this Gaza deal, isn't he?
Well, serious would mean that the Trump administration has a well-thought-out plan to implement what the president wants to do. But what the president wants to do is completely and utterly untethered from reality. In 27 years of advising administrations, Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush, this is clearly one of probably the strangest and most provocative and counterproductive proposals I think that a U.S. president has ever made. I mean, in one fell swoop, he's tethered the United States to a policy at best of voluntary transfer. He's undermined relations with Egypt and Jordan. He's validated the fantasies of the Israeli right wing, and he sent a powerful signal to President Xi and Putin that if you want territory, simply make a declaration without any justification and try to then maneuver and set the terms for how to take it. So, no, I don't think this is a serious proposal. I can't see any way, even the Israelis who may close their eyes and wish there were no Palestinians in Gaza, cannot do what the president wants to do, to use his figures to somehow remove 1.7, 1.8 million people out of a population of 2.3 million. The whole thing is utterly fantastic and frankly, incredibly destructive.
Okay, so owning and buying Gaza, you're saying there isn't a plan, there isn't a strategy. So what is this? Is this just a off-script improvisation?
Oh, I think it flowed from a number of threads, let's say. I think Stephen Witkoff is quite able. Special envoy returned from Gaza, briefed the president on the realities there, which is going to take a decade or more, perhaps. Even if you created a situation where there was no military activity and Hamas was a facilitator rather than obstacle. I think Trump listened very carefully to that. It happened to coincide, Witkoff's return happened to coincide with Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to Washington. I think that the administration had something of a stake in bucking up his right wing as he enters the very important and crucial implementation of phase two. And then I think it's just Donald Trump thinking with the mindset of an opportunistic real estate developer who loves to disrupt. He loves, by his own admission, big, bold, quote, beautiful, unquote, ideas. So I think all of these things, plus increasing frustration, I'm sure that the Arab states, for any number of reasons, in his mind, refuse to step up to assume any responsibility for Gaza. So all of these things combined, you put it in the blender, you hit the switch, and this is what comes out.
I mean, obviously there have been prompt rebukes from lots of countries, especially countries in the region I'm in right now, the Middle East. Which of the rebukes do you think matters the most?
Well, you know, let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that Donald Trump intends to follow through on this. And let's assume that he's going to say to King Abdullah this week and to the Saudi and Egyptian foreign ministers, I'm sure Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will arrive in Washington at some point. Look, he's going to say, you know, I mean, Jordan, $1.6 billion in assistance last year. We're gonna leverage that money. We're going to take it away. And even though he's excluded Egypt and Israel from the suspension of foreign assistance, the FMF, foreign military financing, several $1 billion, let's say he says the same thing to Egypt. I mean, it is extraordinary. Will the Saudis agree to pick up the tab for U.S. assistance should Donald Trump decide to essentially punish Egypt and Jordan, maybe even Saudi Arabia? So again, it's no way to do diplomacy. Shock and awe can work if it's tethered perhaps to shake things up, but if it's tethered to a realistic pathway, and that's hard under any circumstances, given the realities in Gaza.
Sure, and I just wanted to pick up on what you're saying about the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, who's going to be at the White House tomorrow. We've had a sneak preview at some of the language he's likely to use when he talks to President Trump. He's expected to tell him that this proposal is a recipe for radicalism that will spread chaos throughout the Middle East. What's he getting at here, do you think?
I mean, you know, the king obviously is right for Jordan. This is an existential threat. It's not a real estate deal. And, you know, the Jordanians and Egyptians are not going to accept that. But if they should, it would be tantamount for them basically broadcasting to the Arab world that, well, we found a way to resolve the Palestinian problem. We're going to empty Palestinians of Gaza. According to the president, it's going to become big and beautiful. And I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, the president hinted that they'll be making a statement on the West Bank within 4 weeks. It would not surprise me at all if the president came out with a plan to basically cede, Israelis control 60% of the West Bank right now, the Palestinian Authority, with varying forms of controls, and I use the word loosely, 40%. Wouldn't surprise me at all if he comes out and says, look, Israel should be sovereign over what it now controls. So it would effectively be two-state solution, sadly, in my judgment, because I think it's the only, however grim the prospects are, I think it's the only way to even begin to try to untangle the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But essentially what the president is going to preside over the final burial of this idea.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump has obviously heard Israel's side of the story. Benjamin Netanyahu was the first foreign leader to visit the White House since this new administration took office. He's going to be hearing quite a lot of messages like the one from King Abdullah. And do you think that when he starts hearing it coming from some of the leaders that you mentioned a little earlier on, he's going to start taking notice?
Well, the problem is in Trump 1.0, he had a number of individuals who he appointed that I would argue offered adult supervision here and could perhaps counter. This administration's appointees, the currency of the realm here is loyalty. Trump had 6 secretaries of Homeland Security, 4 attorney generals, 2 secretaries of state, 4 directors of national intelligence, and 4 secretaries of defense in 4 years in Trump 1.0. The message to his appointees are very clear. You want to take issue with me? Want to oppose me? You'll be looking for another job. Well, to quote The Apprentice, you're fired.
He seemed to be suggesting that some countries could have a role in the reconstruction of Gaza, or the construction of Gaza, in his words. He was talking about Middle Eastern states in particular. I mean, do you think that was part of a plan to try to incentivize countries to buy into this idea?
Yeah, I mean, somebody's going to have to pay for the reconstruction of Gaza. And in Donald Trump's mind, it's not going to be the United States. It probably won't be the Europeans. So obviously the Gulf states. The question, though, is in a rational world, the administration would propose a plan quite similar to the one Tony Blinken laid out, former Secretary of State Blinken laid out at the Atlantic Council. Effective Palestinian governance over time, some sort of security force, commitments from the Israelis that under certain circumstances, if in fact Hamas was somehow dismantled, that they could end the war. I mean, then you could see a rational pathway, and by the way, some vision for a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'd identify 2 states. I think it holds the most promise, but you need leaders for that. You need leaders in Israel who are masters of their politics, and leaders in Palestine who have the capacity to exert a monopoly over the forces of violence in Palestinian society and unite the Palestinian national movement, which right now looks like Noah's Ark. You've got 2 of everything, 2 constitutions, 2 sets of security services, 2 patrons, 2 visions between Hamas and Fatah of what Palestine should be and where it should be. So I think, again, with a rational plan, a tough-minded businessman like Donald Trump could actually do some good. This, on the other hand, is just full-on crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you said earlier, and I think you put the same comment on Twitter earlier on today, that the 2-state solution's been on life support, you said, for the last 20 years. President Trump, you said, might now preside over its burial. I'm just wondering whether you think something might come after the 2-state solution, a new kind of a solution. I mean, what happens after the 2-state solution is buried?
It's a very good question, and maybe I'm one of the last humans on the planet that still believes that the only way you're going to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is what I call separation through negotiation. There is no other solution that can even presume to resolve the territorial, the religious, the psychological. I mean, can you imagine in the wake of October 7th, Israelis and Palestinians living happily ever after under the same roof? I can't imagine it. So for all the naysayers, the cynics, the skeptics who say, forget the 2-state solution, let's do something else. What is the something else? Israelis and Palestinians need to separate. They also need to create a set of interconnected relations, but the separation needs to occur. I was at the last serious effort, in my judgment, to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when Bill Clinton invited Yasser Arafat and Ehud Barak at Camp David. There we wrestled with the 5 core issues that need to be resolved: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and the end of all conflict and claims. The gaps between Israelis and Palestinians on those 5 issues in a 13-day summit were wider than the Grand Canyon. And nothing that I've seen in the last 24 years, since July of 2000, have narrowed those gaps. I come back to the reality that when anything positive has happened on the Arab-Israeli conflict, it is always because we have leaders who are masters of their political houses, leaders who are prepared to take risks. Sadat Begin, King Hussein, Rabin, even Arafat and Rabin in the first incarnation of Oslo. I'm afraid to say you need a Mandela and you need a de Klerk, and you do not have them. The Arab states can help, and there is a measure of leadership there. But it is the Israeli and Palestinian leaders that need to essentially lead. And frankly, I don't see much indication that that's the kind of leadership and statesmanship we have on either side.
Okay, well, I'm being told we're out of time, but it's been really interesting talking to you. Really appreciate your insights. Aaron David Miller, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Middle East policy analyst and former Pentagon Middle East advisor, Jasmine El Gamel, who joins us from London. Jasmine, great to have you with us. Just before we crossed you, we were speaking to Aaron David Miller, who I'm sure you're familiar with. He was saying the two-state solution's been on life support for the last 20 years. He said that Donald Trump might preside over its burial. I just wondered if you shared that assessment.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And I think when we talk about the two-state solution, whether it's dead or alive, we're really talking about what kind of pressure and commitment not only do the parties to the conflict have to resolve this conflict and move towards a two-state solution, but what kind of resolve, commitment, and support the international community is willing to provide to reach that two-state solution. Because it's not going to happen in a vacuum. On one hand, you have an Arab state initiative, the Arab Peace Initiative, that was first put forth by the Saudis, but in conjunction with the rest of the Arab world and the Muslim world, saying that the Arab world is ready to accept Israel, accept it as a member of the nations in the Middle East, make sure that it is a safe and secure Jewish state in the Middle East in exchange for a Palestinian state, two states living side by side in the region. So to that extent, when people say the two-state solution is dead, we have to ask ourselves, well, why is it dead? It's not because there isn't a plan. It's not because there's not a willingness on the part of the Palestinian Authority and the Arab states to enter into those negotiations. It's because you have intransigent parties like Hamas on one end within the Palestinian side and Prime Minister Netanyahu on the Israeli side who have refused to move forward towards that two-state solution.
Okay, and when it comes to plans and positions, we've obviously heard a lot from President Trump in the last 2 weeks, really, on this particular issue, but particularly in the last 24 hours, back to this idea of owning and reconstructing or building Gaza. He said it's a big real estate site. I just wondered what you make of those comments.
The comments have obviously thrown people for a loop, and they've caused quite a bit of unrest within the Arab states, within the region, amongst Palestinians themselves, who are wondering why Trump is saying these things, what he means by them. Are they really going to happen? So you've seen a lot of agitation basically in the last week just based on those comments. And as you've just mentioned, Donald Trump has been doubling down on those comments as recently as this weekend. I think it's important to keep in mind that none of this can happen without the acquiescence and the support of the Arab states. Now, you have Egypt and Jordan, the two countries that Donald Trump is saying should take in Palestinians from Gaza. They have both come out and said, absolutely not. That is not going to happen. Not only because they refuse to participate in any type of forced relocation or ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Gaza, but also because they worry about the stability of their own countries and their own economies. And if you have those two countries, Saudi Arabia also came out over the weekend condemning these plans and these types of conversations. So if you have the Arab countries united in basically rejecting Donald Trump's plan, then one has to ask, is this really realistic? Or is he saying this as a way to push other countries to come up with their own solutions and their own plans for how to move forward.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it's very difficult to decode the technique here or the strategy here, if indeed there is one. But what's interesting about what you're saying, in particular with regard to Jordan, is that King Abdullah is going to be visiting the United States tomorrow, I gather. We'll be holding face-to-face talks with President Trump. And President Trump's going to hear it in first person, that outright flat rejection that probably sounded like an extremely good idea to the last visitor to the White House, which was, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu. How much of a difference do you think that's going to make to how Donald Trump views this idea?
Look, I think it's going to be a very significant visit. Jordan's King Abdullah has dealt with numerous administrations, and Jordan has always been a really close ally of the United States. It's a critical part, Jordan is a critical part of the regional security architecture that helps the U.S. achieve its own goals of security and stability in the region, as well as that of Israel. I think it's important to remember that a few months ago, when Iran directed missiles towards Israel in an unprecedented direct attack on Israeli territory, that Jordanian missiles were the ones shooting those Iranian rockets over Jordanian airspace as they were making their way to Israel. Now, this is something that I believe that Jordan's King Abdullah is going to be raising with Donald Trump. He's going to be reminding him just how critical a role Jordan plays in providing that stability and security in the Middle East, which is directly in the U.S. national interest and in the Israeli national interest. He's also likely going to mention the fact that Jordan has already taken millions of Palestinian refugees over the years, and that continuing to try to empty out Palestinian territory from its inhabitants is not going to provide any sort of semblance of security or stability in the region moving forward. If anything, it's only going to cause more chaos, more displacement. It's going to give terrorists more fodder for recruitment, for resistance. And so nothing about this plan, if we can call it a plan, as you said, really makes a lot of sense. I think you'll see Jordan's King Abdullah reiterating to Donald Trump the importance of the Arab Peace Initiative, the significance of that, and the importance of putting some pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu to meet the Arab states in the middle and try to focus on how Israel is going to continue to honor its commitments to the ceasefire as we go into negotiations over phase 2 and 3, and how we're going to move forward in the region in a way that makes all of the countries in the region secure and stable, not just the Israelis.
Sure. So it sounds like, by saying what we gather he's going to say, King Abdullah, tomorrow, he's going to say this idea is a recipe for radicalism that will spread chaos through the Middle East. I mean, he may try, mightn't he, to sell it to President Trump that not just destabilizing the region and causing chaos in the region, but this could boomerang back and actually affect U.S. national security.
Absolutely. I mean, we only have to look back, we don't have to look back very far to look at how conflict in the region has always spread outside of the region. You can't contain violence in the Middle East. I was working at the Pentagon when the Syria conflict first started, when those peaceful protests in Syria against the Assad regime turned violent, when the state used its weapons against those peaceful protesters. We saw what happened. We saw the recruitment of fighters into the country. We saw the refugee crisis that spilled over into Europe. We saw the impact that conflict had on countries far beyond the borders of the Middle East. Same thing happened with the Iraq War. And so it's absolute madness to think that conflict in the region that is stoked by things like displacement and terrorism and occupation and all of the things that we're seeing play out right now are going to only affect people living in the region. This is not just a Middle East problem. It's a global security issue that has to be decided and addressed in a way that actually gets to the root causes of instability and conflict in the region, not just putting Band-Aids on bullet holes as the West and even Arab countries themselves sometimes have been doing for decades past. This is about addressing the root causes of conflict. And one of those root causes is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli occupation, Hamas, conflict, armed actors in the region. Those are things that have to be addressed holistically in a way that is long-term and sustainable. And what Donald Trump is talking about right now, not only does it really not make a lot of sense, but it also could prove to be extremely detrimental for that security and stability that is so necessary for the Middle East and indeed for global security right now.
Yeah, indeed. And just looking at your Twitter feed as well, Jasmine, I mean, you don't single out President Biden for his handling of these issues. You also had some criticism of his predecessor, President Biden. And I'm just wondering what your thinking was in terms of criticizing him for not having brought about that the ceasefire deal sooner than he did. What were you thinking there?
Well, we saw over a period of almost 15 months how the Biden administration really could never manage to get the Israelis to enter into good faith negotiations around a ceasefire deal, nor use any additional pressure leverage that the U.S. had on the Israelis, and especially with Prime Minister Netanyahu, to try to get him to move. And these are not just my words or my opinion. I mean, we heard this time and time again from Israeli negotiators involved in the negotiating process. We've heard it from Arab negotiators from the Arab states, and we've also heard it from Netanyahu's own former cabinet members. In fact, very high-level Israeli officials time and again over the last 15 months have mentioned how Netanyahu has been a huge obstacle towards moving forward on a ceasefire deal and preventing any progress in talks around a post-war scenario in Gaza. I myself have talked to both Arab and Palestinian officials who have reiterated to me that the Palestinian Authority is ready to go into Gaza in a post-war scenario, that Hamas has an understanding that it will not be involved in post-war governance. And what they're saying to me is that they cannot get Prime Minister Netanyahu to budge on his refusal for the PA, the Palestinian Authority, not just Hamas, for the Palestinian Authority to be involved in post-war governance in Gaza. And this is something that neither President Biden was able to make any headway on. And now it appears that President Trump, now we don't know what's being said behind the scenes, but what he has done publicly so far with his statements around Gaza is give new energy, and he's breathed new life into the right-wing extremist narrative in Israel that has since the beginning of the war called for whether it's forced relocation or voluntary migration of Palestinians from Gaza and settlement of Gaza and increasing settlements in the West Bank as well. We've always known that that's the extremist right-wing vision in Israel. And now that camp has basically perceived that they're getting a green light from Donald Trump to continue talking and thinking and planning for that scenario. So we've seen now 2 consecutive US presidents making moves that are taking us away from conversations about a 2-state solution, a continuation of the ceasefire deal, and all of the things that we're supposed to be talking about, and instead talking about things that probably will never come to fruition, because as I said, and I think it's important to reiterate, none of this can happen without the acquiescence and the support of the Arab states in the region. And they have unequivocally said that they will not allow it.
Just lastly, I mean, I put this question to the previous guest, but do you think this idea and the reaction to it could end up damaging or jeopardizing the Abraham Accords?
I think in terms of the expansion of the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia at the very highest levels of their government have been unequivocal, whether it's the Crown Prince, MBS, or Prince Turki Al Faisal, who recently gave a very clear interview with Christiane Amanpour on CNN, basically reiterating that there will be no movement towards normalization with Saudi Arabia unless there is a Palestinian state and a commitment to a Palestinian state. And so when you look at, and the UAE, which is a signatory currently of the Abraham Accords, has also said that they will not allow the forced relocation of Palestinians from Gaza. And even Egypt has been quietly, sending messages that if this kind of conversation continues, that their peace treaty with Israel may be at stake. Now, I don't think we're there yet. I think it's important to just realize how frustrated and disturbed the Arab states have been about Donald Trump's remarks. They thought when he came in, he was campaigning on issues of expanding the peace, expanding the Abraham Accords, avoiding U.S. involvement in the region, especially U.S. military involvement. So everything that's happened in the last week is just a complete 180 from what people were expecting to see out of this press conference with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I think in terms of the Abraham Accords, in terms of any relationship with the Arab states, with Israel and the Arab states moving forward, you're really going to see a lot more stringent messaging coming out of those states saying that you cannot be a member of this community of nations in the Middle East when you are refusing to move forward towards a peace deal that has been offered to you time and time again. This is going to have consequences for your relationships in the region, and really hoping that that messaging will have an impact on President Trump. And we'll see starting tomorrow with King Abdullah's visit to Washington whether that's going to start to resonate with him.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Jasmine El Gamel. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, as the war in Ukraine approaches its third anniversary, the US President Donald Trump has revealed that he has indeed held talks with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Talks, we understand, that are aimed at ending the conflict, although few details were given. Well, this is the first official acknowledgement of a conversation between President Putin and a US president since early 2022. Let's take a look.
Well, I don't want to talk about it. And if we are talking, I don't want to tell you about the conversation. It's too early. But I do believe we're making progress. We want to stop the Ukraine-Russia war. And I want to stop it just because I hate to see all these young people being killed. And I expect to have many more conversations. We have to get that war ended. Should have never happened, would have never happened if I was president. I would imagine I would be meeting with Putin, yes, at the right time. I think at the right time, at the appropriate time.
President Donald Trump speaking there. Well, despite his comments, the Kremlin gave a cryptic response, neither confirming nor denying whether or not the two men had spoken. While Moscow has stated it is yet to receive a credible offer to begin talks on Ukraine. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Matthew Bryza, former US Ambassador to Azerbaijan, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia. Ambassador Bryza, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It appears that Presidents Trump and Putin have spoken to discuss Ukraine. If that is indeed the case, how significant is it?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for having me with you. Well, first of all, Trump didn't say how recently they may have spoken, and it's come out in U.S. media that they have several times, never specified how many, but several times spoken in recent years. So it really does sound like they spoke recently, and then like within the last few days, and then based on what Kremlin press spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, he said, well, conversations may have happened, but I don't know all the conversations, so I can neither confirm nor deny. Here's a very strange treatment of this conversation. It sounds like Trump wanted to announce it and Putin didn't want to. So, okay, let's say they spoke. If they spoke, Trump has made clear he wants a deal to end the war. He called himself a peacemaker in his inauguration address, and he knows that for there to be a deal, it's got to be accepted on both sides. So a lot of people, myself included, were worried that Trump was going to sell out Ukraine and compel Zelensky to agree to concessions that would be very difficult for him to accept politically. But I at this point, I don't believe that anymore. I think Trump is probably, he has told Putin, look, you've got to end this war. Zelensky wants to negotiate. If you don't negotiate an end to the fighting, President Putin, then we're gonna increase tariffs or taxes, as Trump calls it, and try to push your teetering economy over the edge, is my guess.
Okay, but that phone call, if indeed it happened, it's not the phone call we were promised on the campaign trail, the phone call that was supposed to end the war in 24 hours. It didn't have that desired effect, did it?
No, and that was always impossible. And President Trump's Ukraine envoy, General Keith Kellogg, he said a couple of weeks ago, okay. Overnight's not possible. I think he said 100 days. And so he's imminently headed to Kiev. He'll be at the Munich Security Conference along with Vice President Vance later this week and is expected to head onward to Kiev. So Trump clearly wants to meet Putin, and I think Kellogg's trip will help set that up. And if there was a call, there probably was between Putin and Trump in recent days, that's probably clearing the way for General Kellogg's visit.
Sure, and indeed, this issue, as you say, likely to be very high up the agenda at Munich. I'm just wondering how different you think the red lines set by the United States will be under the Trump administration from what they were under President Biden.
Yeah, first of all, they were kind of pink lines under Biden in some cases because neither President Biden nor National Security Advisor Sullivan ever came out explicitly and said, we want Ukraine to win. They constantly said, we want to position Ukraine to be stronger when there's a future negotiation with Russia. But still, that sounds like supporting Ukraine. I think with Trump, what he wants is simply an end of fighting. And he doesn't care. I think what the Biden administration cared about was that there be a just peace from Ukraine's perspective, meaning not surrendering its territory, but maybe having an ambiguous legal status of the areas occupied by Russia now. I think Trump won't care about those diplomatic and legal important questions, but I think he's just going to go for a ceasefire and then, realizes Zelensky will have to sell it domestically, but won't be emotionally attached to sort of the immorality of President Putin invading and trying to annex another country's territory.
Yeah, I want to talk about President Zelensky and his relationship with Donald Trump in just a moment. But just specifically about red lines, when it comes to Russia's red lines, they don't seem to have changed at all, do they? Because we've heard from the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, who says all of President Putin's conditions for ending the conflict in Ukraine must be met before any settlement is possible. There is absolutely no shift on their part, is there?
Yeah. I mean, that's classic Russian bluster. I mean, Deputy Minister Ryabkov is a longtime number 2 in the embassy in Washington, very well known there. And we all know that what the Russians do great is bluster. As a senior member of the Russian parliament told me 20-some years ago, he said, look, we know that we believe fear is the most powerful diplomatic tool. So we want to frighten the heck out of everybody. So we never want to look weak. But they know very well that the toll of human life is mounting. Now, granted, President Putin doesn't seem to care much about the loss of soldiers, but there's a limit, not just numerical, but also political in Russia. And the economy, as I alluded to before, is not as strong as Western observers think. Yes, the Russian economy has continued to grow, but inflation is very high. That's led to an increase in interest rates. The interest rate increase also helps the Russian banks that are forced to give loans to the defense sector. But as those interest rates increase, more and more companies are going to go bankrupt. So there's only so far Putin can go with his economy totally on a war footing. Trump understands that, and I think is going to squeeze the Russian economy now.
Yeah, this war isn't just about 2 presidents, is it? It's about a lot more people than that. A lot more parties are engaged, are involved. I'm just wondering how much you think President Trump is running things by NATO allies, before and after conversations with the other key player in all of this, President Putin.
Yeah, that, Tom, is the key question. And me as I grew up as a Cold Warrior. My whole Foreign Service career was in it. And, for all of us of my generation, NATO was at the center of everything. And we would coordinate every major national security initiative abroad with our NATO allies. I don't think Trump That's certainly not his instinct. I mean, he questioned whether or not NATO was obsolete, as you'll recall, in his first term. And as we see in the way he handled the Gaza Riviera proposal with Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, sitting next to him, he completely blindsided Netanyahu when Trump, made that amazing announcement. So I think in the case of NATO, there's not nearly as much cooperation by Trump as there would otherwise be. However, having said that, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, they similarly come from the same kind of intellectual background as I do, where you really do coordinate with your NATO allies. But I think Trump won't feel constrained by the allies. He may take their advice, but I think his senior advisors will, of course, care about that coordination. But having said that, I mean, I saw a bunch of signs and international media coverage today from Kiev with Ukrainians holding up the slogan, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So they're worried. They're worried they'll be frozen out, and then also maybe that NATO will be frozen out.
Yeah, indeed. And that brings me to the question about President Zelensky. And I'm just wondering what sort of a relationship Kyiv has now with this new US administration, because they were pretty fearful about this scenario, the scenario in which President Trump returned to the White House. That's what they've got now. How do you think they're dealing with it?
Yeah, and Putin was very hopeful Trump would return because he expected Trump would cut off all military aid to Ukraine. And a couple of weeks ago, what Trump said was, okay, Ukraine should not join NATO. The war should end. But we need to continue the military aid to Ukraine for the indefinite future to make sure they can defend themselves should Russia again try to be the aggressor against Ukraine. That was a surprise to a lot of analysts, certainly to me, probably a pleasant surprise to Zelensky. But underlying all of that is the fact that it was Trump's phone call to Zelensky way back when in the first Trump term, when Trump allegedly tried to pressure or even blackmail Zelensky, saying, if you don't provide negative and derogatory information on President Biden and his son Hunter, we will not provide you military technical assistance. That led to Trump's first impeachment. So, and Trump has said he thinks that Zelensky is little more than a showman. So I don't think Trump likes Zelensky, but I do think Trump wants to cut a deal. And Zelensky's, one of the two parties to the deal.
And Zelensky's quite a cunning operator, isn't he? He's pretty savvy on the world stage, and he's going to be really sidling up to the vice president when the two men see each other in the next couple of days. I mean, do you think J.D. Vance could be sort of the key to Donald Trump's full unconditional support?
I do very much agree that Zelensky will get as close to J.D. Vance as he possibly can. And yes, Zelensky's savvy. I mean, he's a former comedic actor, right? And a fantastically successful entrepreneur. And he knows how to deal with people. But J.D. Vance was one of the first U.S. senators who sounded the alarm against continued U.S. military assistance to Ukraine. So rather than maybe being the conduit or the bridge between Zelensky and Trump, I think Zelensky probably assumes he needs to win over J.D. Vance first if he wants to build a warmer relationship with Trump.
Do you think we're going to be seeing a lot of this? I mean, this is slightly going off piece, but promises that were made on the campaign, that were one thing on the campaign, but now just seem to be, pipe dreams. That phone call being just one of them.
Yeah. Well, I love skiing off piste. That's the best. So thanks for the question. I think Trump he's been shooting from the hip. Yes, notoriously during an election campaign, I mean, proposals are not rigorously thought through because you've got, thousands of staffers all competing for the candidate's attention, trying to say something that's provocative and bold. And so those are not policy initiatives. So it's very common that foreign policy initiatives deviate in reality from the campaign. But Trump is continuing that unpredictability into his administration, by design. He believes if unpredictability is a useful tool to keep his opponents and friends on the back of their heels or on their toes. But also, I think he does not yet have a rigorous policy-making process in place. I spent 4 years on the National Security Council staff of President George W. Bush and was part of a rigorous system for analyzing, proposing, and taking decisions. And that does not yet exist in the Trump administration. The National Security Council staff has nowhere near the number of people it needs at this point.
Just lastly, going back to Ukraine and what sort of a future the country has, I mean, do you think it's inevitable that the outcome of a brokered solution, a peace deal, will mean that the 4 regions of Ukraine that are claimed and mostly controlled by Russia will ultimately be surrendered. Do you think that's inevitable?
No, I think Ukraine will never surrender them, but as a matter of practicality, we'll probably look for a bit of constructive ambiguity and say the legal status of those regions, the four regions on mainland Ukraine and Crimea, will be deferred into the future, maybe 15, 20 years or sometime in the future. And for now, let's settle things on the ground such that the war is over and it won't start again.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Matthew Bryza, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be with you.
Now, if they charge us, we charge them. So said Donald Trump as he promised reciprocal tariffs on countries that tax US imports, although he didn't name specific targets. However, tariffs on steel and aluminium are confirmed, with President Trump announcing a 25% import tax on all steel and aluminium entering the United States. Well, according to economists, this move will primarily impact Canada and Mexico, two of America's top trading partners for both metals. Well, during his first term, President Trump imposed similar tariffs on steel and aluminium from Canada, Mexico, and the EU. And that raised costs for US car manufacturers, even for the makers of fizzy drinks, which use aluminium cans.
I'll be announcing probably Tuesday or Wednesday at a news conference reciprocal tariffs, and very simply, it's if they charge us, we charge them. Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
10%?
No, 25%. Nobody can have a majority stake for U.S. Steel. They can for other companies, but not for U.S. Steel.
US President Donald Trump speaking there. Well, we can speak now to Everett Eissenstat, the former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council of the United States under President Trump. Thank you very much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports. Is this justified in your opinion?
If you go back to the initial, under the first administration, that steel and aluminum tariffs were put in place under a Section 232 national security investigation. And one of the determinants of whether to impose tariffs at that time was whether the U.S. had the capacity of producing a certain percentage of steel domestically, and it was determined that we did not. Since then, there's been a number of exclusions, exceptions, negotiated outcomes that have in some ways probably diminished the effectiveness of that objective. And so I think that's probably what is driving the president's determination that we need to include those tariffs and increase them on some products.
Just remind us, what was the impact of those tariffs during the first administration and how everything was resolved?
Well, there were a number of different impacts. I mean, this was the first time that tariffs had been imposed writ large, on on a product across the entire globe. And so one of the first impacts is there was a lot of efforts by different countries to distinguish themselves from the type of steel they produced, where they produced it, making the argument that, well, that it's not produced in the United States, you can't get it in the US. And that had some impact. And so there were different quotas negotiated with different countries. There were exceptions made, and I think that may have, at the end of the day, getting up to that magic number, and if I call it correctly, I think it was 85% was the capacity that was sought under the initial ruling, the investigation, that kind of diminished the ability to do that. So this is probably an attempt to kind of recalibrate that and see if we can't get more of that production here in the United States.
Just tell us which sectors of the US economy, obviously ones that use steel and aluminium, are most likely to be affected. Is defense one of them?
Certainly. Well, defense is certainly one of them, but much of that defense is, needs to be domestically produced anyway for the defense industry. But certainly automobiles would be a big consumer. Anybody who produces products that are packaged in aluminum or steel cans would be impacted by this. So really it goes to a number of different industries. I would think some types of construction would be impacted by this as well. Really anyone that's a consumer of steel would probably feel the impacts.
And then, of course, there's US consumers themselves. Are they likely, do you think, to face price rises? What does this mean for the average American?
Well, it depends on what, the consumer, it depends on the product, and it depends on our capacity to meet the needs of the market. So that I think there'll be different outcomes for different products. There may be some increase in overall cost to bring production back to the United States. The president has noted that in putting out some of the broader tariff agenda, that there will be disruption, but that at the end of the day, this is in the best interest of the U.S. economy, that it'll make the economy grow, and ultimately leave the U.S. better off than it was prior to his actions.
But there will be some short-term pain, won't there? Because, for example, the EU is thinking about, reportedly, imposing a tariff on American whiskey, a tariff of around 50%. We've also heard that China has added some American companies to a list of unreliable entities, and one of those companies is Calvin Klein, another is Tommy Hilfiger. I mean, there are going to be sectors of the economy, there are going to be companies that feel real pain from the retaliatory measures taken by countries.
Well, certainly countries have, the right and can make up their own determination of whether retaliation is the right answer. I know we also have pending this concept of a reciprocal universal tariff. And of course, one response is for countries to raise tariffs and go for a tit for tat escalation of increasing tariffs and bringing in different parts of the economy. I think the situation with China demonstrates that they're reaching the capacity to retaliate with just tariffs. So they're now looking at other economic coercion methods to try to change the calculus. Now, another option is for a country to say, okay, well, if you want reciprocal tariffs, let's do that. We'll drop our tariffs. We'll go to zero. Let's go 0 for 0. And I think that would be a really interesting dynamic. It might lead to, a more level playing field for everyone involved. So it really depends on how the countries react. But certainly countries could decide that, well, we want to increase tariffs and that's what we're going to do. They might pick particular products they believe are politically sensitive, like whiskey. That's happened in the past. It's not proven to be that effective. But, they have the right and certainly the ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the countries most affected by these latest tariffs will be Brazil, Canada, and Mexico. But so many other countries, including the whole of the European Union, are bracing themselves for yet more tariffs out of the Trump administration. Do you see us reaching a point where all of these countries affected start talking to each other and working out ways to perhaps up trade between themselves and somehow collectively punish the United States? I guess the essence of my question is, might all of this boomerang back to the United States and seriously damage the US economy?
It's really a great question, and there's a lot of different parts to that. One, I think it's important to remember that the U.S. economy, while is very much does export a lot, it is not the most significant portion of our economy. A lot of our growth is produced domestically. We're not super exposed on tariffs. The other piece is that countries may decide to realign supply chains, and that would be an interesting dynamic. I think the president, even in the America First trade policy that he articulated, has expressed an openness to look for sectoral and other types of agreements. There's one thing that's certain: it will be impactful. There's no doubt that imposing these types of measures is going to have a significant impact on the global supply chain and where countries produce and who they trade with. One of the ironies here is that there's no real country that has the capacity to absorb as much output from some of these economies as the United States. So they can create different agreements amongst themselves, but at the end of the day, can those economies actually absorb the output that is being created by their trading partners? And there's very few countries in the world that can do that. It would be wonderful if we if this led to an outcome of sustained growth and economic openness for countries, beyond the United States, so that more economies could absorb more output from different markets.
In terms of a trump card or an Achilles heel or whatever you want to call it, I mean, China holds the key when it comes to rare earths. I think when it comes to refining them, they really are in charge. And I'm just wondering whether if they suddenly turned off the tap with regards to how many of these refined rare earths made it into the United States, whether they could almost, I mean, just looking at the dependency on rare earths in so many different sectors, whether they could really bring the US economy to its knees.
It would be disruptive, and they've actually done that. Where they're not just the United States. I mean, China's imposed export controls every time they have a conflict, even in the Asia Pacific. Sometimes they'll impose export controls on their critical minerals. And what that tells me is that countries need to think about whether dependence upon China for those minerals is the right idea. If they're going to use it for economic coercion purposes, and it may look to other markets. Now, there are a lot of other critical minerals that are not yet online that probably would accelerate a search for those. Certainly, this is a signal that's something that countries that rely on these critical minerals need to take that into account. So yeah, it could be impactful, but it also could drive, as I mentioned, a realignment of supply chains, which would actually diminish the effectiveness of China's ability to use those export controls for coercive purposes.
Sure, and people might also pivot away from the United States, because I'm just wondering whether perhaps there is a danger here that these kind of measures damage trust, and to the extent that the United States gets labeled by countries as just being an unreliable trading partner. I mean, is that a risk?
It's quite a shock to the system. I have no doubt about that. I think the United States has been the most open economies for decades, and we've really led the world in market opening. In the grand bargain, most listeners may not have followed, the evolution of trade policy, but the grand bargain post World War II is that the U.S. would open up its economy. We would do that, enable for Europe and Japan and others to have a market so they could rebound and grow, and they did. The WTO was designed to enable other economies to join on similar basis. That didn't actually work out that way. Many of them joined with special treatment. Another element of it is that, the U.S., one of the trade-offs for opening up the U.S. market was the ability to use trade remedies to protect that market in times of by subsidization and surge in imports. And a lot of those trade remedies were diminished by the WTO. So this was a part of a grand bargain, this multi-decade market opening by the United States. At the end of the day, I believe that what has evolved is lack of trust in those institutions, and the understanding that, well, maybe we need to do this on our own and try a different methodology and see if we can't get to a fairer trading system that way. So it's definitely a change, and I think it's very something that is highly disruptive and certainly going to make an impact for a long time. We'll have to see how it evolves. We're just beginning. This is I think we're less than 3 weeks into the administration. There's a long way to go, and there's a long agenda ahead. So we'll see how this evolves over the next several weeks and years.
And just lastly, I mean, every time we talk about tariffs, and we've heard about them the last few weeks, lots of countries have been mentioned, but one country that almost never gets mentioned is my country, the United Kingdom. And I'm just wondering why the UK has managed to dodge this tariff bullet. Is there a reason, do you think?
Well, again, we're very early in the administration. I do think there's a favorable balance of trade, at least seen from the U.S. with the Great Britain. That may be part of it. There are opportunities. There's been discussion for many years about a bilateral agreement with the United Kingdom, and perhaps that's the way it will go over time. And I think there's also an affinity that rests between our economies. But there are some elements there that does put the economy, I think, at a different place. But that doesn't mean if we go for a universal reciprocal tariff, well, then that might change, and it certainly could be subject to tariffs as well. It's an evolving picture for sure. We'll see what this week brings, but we do know that tariffs are on the horizon, and they're going to continue to be used as a favored tool for this administration.
Yeah, well, it looks like we put aside our differences with regards to how we pronounce the word aluminium. You say aluminum, we say aluminium. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to leave it there. Everett, Eissenstat, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Tom. Take care.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.